throw them at me, and those stones would catch fire and burn them, something like that. Could you tell it more like that? Come on.
Jesus sat among his disciples and asked, "Who am I?" One disciple said, "You are a righteous angel." Another, "You are a wise philosopher." Another, "You are a great teacher." But Thomas sat silent, eyes cast down. Jesus stared at him. The others nudged him. "Thomas, the Lord is asking. Answer him." Thomas finally spoke. "My words are incapable of describing who you are." Jesus shouted at him, "I am not your teacher." Then, just as suddenly, he walked over, put his arm around Thomas, and led him outside. They walked by the river for hours, speaking words the others could not hear.
I didn't like your telling of that story. You have to understand, the disciples were very cliquish, right? I want you to divide the disciples up into cliques, right? And Thomas was the only one not in a clique. He was like the kid that none of them, the know-it-all, right? No one liked that person. Oh God, know-it-all Thomas. Always can't go along with it, right? So, and it was one group, they all like, who am I? And they kind of get together, like, like a conference. And they're like, oh, what's the answer? What's the answer? And they come up with an answer. I want you, and who would have said he is like a righteous, angel? And another clique, which maybe is Paul, right? I don't know. What group would have been there? Really embellish. I want you to get into the story. And then Jesus shouts at him because he goes, "My Lord and teacher," right? It doesn't make sense. The way you said it doesn't make sense, because you're like, "Oh, my words are no good." And then why did Jesus yell at him?
The disciples divided. The disciples were always in groups.
Yeah.
They had their own cliques, their own alliances.
Yeah.
Except for Thomas. Thomas was the outsider, the know-it-all, the one who thought too much. He didn't just accept things like the others. So when Jesus asked, "Who am I?" the groups huddled up, whispering, debating, eager to give the best answer. The first clique, the mystics. John, James, and a few others were deep into divine visions. They believed Jesus was something not
The
quite
mystics.
human. After a moment, John stood and said, "You are a righteous angel sent from heaven." Jesus didn't react. He just stared, waiting. The second clique, the scholars, led by Paul or Matthew. They were the thinkers, the debaters, the ones who liked things structured, logical. Matthew, ever the scribe, cleared his throat. "You are a wise philosopher, a teacher of divine truths." Again, Jesus said nothing. He simply looked around. The third clique, the traditionalists, led by Peter. Peter, always the loudest, stood up. He was the enforcer, the defender. To him, Jesus had to fit into the old ways, the Messiah prophecy. Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Some of the disciples nodded. This felt like the correct answer. But still, Jesus said nothing. And then his eyes fell on Thomas. Thomas, the outsider. Thomas hadn't joined a group. He never did. The disciples turned to him. "Thomas, the Lord is asking. Answer him." Thomas looked down. He had no prepared answer, no grand declaration. Finally he spoke, "My Lord and teacher, my words are incapable of describing who you are." And Jesus shouted at him, "I am not your teacher." The room went silent. The disciples stared, confused. Why was he angry? But then, just as suddenly, Jesus walked over, placed his arm around Thomas, and led him outside. They walked by the river for hours, speaking words no one else would hear. When Thomas returned, the disciples surrounded him. "What did he tell you?" Thomas hesitated. "He taught me 3 words." "What words? Tell us." Thomas sighed and said, "If I told you even the first word, you would pick up stones and throw them at me, and fire would leap from those stones and burn you." He said nothing more.
What were the 3 words?
The 3 words were never recorded, but they were not meant to be recorded, because the moment they are spoken, they become coloring. Thomas understood, the others did not. That is why Jesus chose him.
Do you guys know what the 3 words